Have you ever been so good at what you do that it made the wrong people uncomfortable? It's a strange thing, how consistency, loyalty, and quiet results can become invisible in a world chasing trends and titles. I didn't think that after 18 years of building trust, partnerships, and record-breaking growth, I'd find myself sitting across from someone half my age, explaining why relationships still matter. But that's exactly where I was, the day I got fired. They said it was about innovation, about aligning with a digital-first future, about evolving the brand, but I knew better. What they really wanted was silence, and what they feared most was what I had seen. I wasn't the type to start a war. I didn't send a scorched earth email or post some dramatic story on social media. I packed up my things, shook the hands I could still respect, and walked out with my dignity. What happened next wasn't a plan for revenge. It wasn't even a plan at all. It started with a phone call from a client who had heard the news before I had even made it to my car, and it ended with the entire company begging me to come back. My name is Daniel Rourke, and for nearly 2 decades, I was the backbone of Keystone Media Group's client development division. When I joined in 2005, the company was still recovering from a failed merger, morale was low, and half the sales team had quit within 6 months. I was brought on as a regional rep with no real resources, no established territories, and a client roster made up of school districts that barely returned phone calls. But I saw something different in Keystone, something worth fighting for. While the leadership was focused on flashy pitch decks and buzzwords, I hit the road. For years, I drove from Chicago to small towns in Indiana, Michigan, and Missouri, meeting with superintendents, librarians, department chairs, anyone who still believed in the value of quality educational content. I didn't push platforms, I asked questions, I listened, and over time, they trusted me. Within 5 years, I wasn't just managing a region, I was leading the national team. Keystone's educational licensing deals grew 370% under my direction. We went from scraping by to signing exclusive state-level contracts that secured the company's financial future. The CEO at the time, Michael Chen, once told me, "We didn't realize how critical you were until we saw the renewal rates. But I didn't chase recognition. I kept my desk in the open floor plan with everyone else. No executive suite, no gatekeepers. I kept handwritten notes on every client, remembered their kids' names, their retirement plans, even which university their niece had just gotten into. Not because it was strategic, because it was human. By the time 2022 came around, my division alone was responsible for over 60% of Keystone's recurring revenue. That wasn't just a number. It was a reflection of every late-night call I'd taken, every district I'd helped navigate a new curriculum standard, every trust I'd earned that had outlasted 3 rounds of rebranding. I was never loud about my wins. I didn't talk over people in meetings or flood Slack with motivational quotes. I just showed up every day for the company, for the clients, for the team. And for a while, that was enough. But things started shifting subtly after Keystone was acquired by a private equity firm. The pressure to modernize became constant. We started using terms like scalable engagement funnels and cross-platform curriculum ecosystems, phrases that sounded impressive until you tried explaining them to a high school principal who just wanted materials that worked in real classrooms. Still, I adapted where I could. I coached my team on digital platforms, encouraged CRM use, and attended every strategic planning session I was invited to. But I always led with the same principle. Business moves at the speed of trust. That's what had kept us alive when we were on the brink. That's what clients stayed for. Not the software, not the slogans. I didn't know it then, but that very mindset, the one that had built the company's success, was being quietly marked for extinction. And the person leading that change had already decided I didn't belong in the future she was designing. Her name was Lena Morgan, and from the moment she walked into the all-hands meeting that January morning, I knew everything was about to change. She didn't just introduce herself as the new CEO, she branded herself. Dressed in minimalist gray with a perfectly rehearsed cadence, She stood beneath a projection slide that read, "Disrupt, digitize, dominate." She spoke in a language that was heavy on disruption and light on substance, the kind of language that turns heads in boardrooms but raises eyebrows in classrooms. Lena had come from an elite consultancy in New York, with a resume filled with words like transformational leader and digital-first strategist. She had never worked in education, had never sat in a teacher's lounge, and certainly had never listened to a superintendent explain why their literacy rates were dropping because their budget had been slashed again. But the board, now stacked, with private equity advisors, loved her. She was young, media-savvy, and promised explosive growth through scalable technology and AI-integrated content delivery. She was, as one investor said with giddy confidence, exactly the kind of leader our industry needs. From the beginning, Lena seemed uncomfortable with how I operated. While I spent my days in the field, in the schools, in the lived reality of our clients, she floated in strategy sessions with words like velocity mapping and content gamification. She made quick work of reshuffling the leadership structure, creating 3 new departments with vague titles, and imported several of her former colleagues from the Vertex Group, her old consultancy. They weren't employees. They were engagement, architects on retainer, at a price that made even our CFO shift in his seat. I didn't speak out. Not yet. I still believed I could adapt, that there was a place for someone like me in this shiny new version of Keystone. I joined her digital vision task force, offered to help translate her strategies into language educators could actually use. She smiled politely in meetings, nodded at my suggestions, but never once followed up. Then came the reports. One of my account managers, Maria, forwarded me a file by accident. It included internal memos about Phase 1 reassignment, code, for pulling clients from my team and giving them to the newly formed Digital Learning Acceleration Unit. The justification? They wanted fresh, platform-native perspectives. Most of those clients were ones I had managed for over a decade. Still, I waited, observed, tried to understand the game being played. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, when I sat in on a budget review and noticed a line item, $2.7 million, allocated to Vertex Consulting for strategic innovation. No deliverables listed, no timeline, no board discussion I'd been aware of. I flagged it quietly to our controller, who looked visibly nervous and whispered, "It came from Lena's office. No one's questioning it." That night, I stayed, late, and combed through 6 months of finance reports. The numbers didn't lie. Something wasn't adding up. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I knew enough to understand how power consolidates in corporate environments. Speak too soon and you're labeled as resistant. Wait too long and you're irrelevant. But I documented everything, kept copies, talked to a few trusted colleagues, and one of them, a developer from our curriculum platform, dropped the final piece. "She's routing contracts through a side entity," he said, "one of the Vertex subsidiaries. It's technically legal, but it's shady." That's when I knew. My future at Keystone wasn't just uncertain, it was already written. The only question left was how they'd make the exit look clean. The meeting request came on a Wednesday morning. No subject line. Just a calendar invite from Lena's assistant for 3 p.m., Executive Conference Room B. No context, no agenda. Just a time, a place, and an unspoken finality. I'd been around long enough to recognize the pattern. The carefully impersonal tone, the midweek slot, the absence of HR in the email, but you knew they'd be there. It didn't matter that I was managing nearly 2/3 of the company's revenue. It didn't matter that our client retention rate under my team was still north of 90%, while the new acceleration teams were losing contracts faster than they could draft onboarding packets. The decision had already been made. Still, I walked in with my head high. Lena sat at the end of the long glass table, flanked by an HR director I'd never met and a company lawyer I vaguely recognized from an all-hands video call last quarter. Her assistant didn't even make eye contact as he shut the door behind me. "Daniel," she said, voice measured and clinical. "Thank you for making time. This won't take long." No one ever says that unless they want it to be over before. You speak. She used words like strategic realignment, philosophical divergence, and digital future readiness. She never mentioned results, never brought up clients. Not once did she acknowledge that the relationships I had built were the reason Keystone still existed. Instead, she said my approach no longer aligned with the company's forward trajectory, and that effective immediately, my employment would be terminated. They'd offer me a generous severance package in exchange for my signature on a standard release, 6 months' pay, 3 months of health coverage, a non-compete clause that effectively barred me from working with any client I'd developed over the last 15 years. I didn't argue. Not because I wasn't furious, because I knew how this worked. The paper had already been drawn. The legal team had already signed off, and anything I said would be transcribed, summarized, and potentially weaponized later. I simply nodded, stood up, and thanked them for the opportunity. As I left, Lena extended her hand. I shook it because some of us still do things the old way. When I got back to my office, the lights were already dimmed. A cardboard box sat on my desk, prepared by someone who hadn't even waited for the formal announcement. My nameplate was gone. I packed quietly. No goodbye emails, no dramatics. Just the quiet dignity of a man who had already lost what mattered most, his trust in the people he had once believed in. But as I reached for my coat, I noticed something tucked under my keyboard. A plain white envelope with no markings. Inside was a printed spreadsheet. No context, no sender, just numbers. It was a breakdown of the Vertex contracts, dates, payments, and internal transfer memos. One stood out, a $640,000 payment labeled Consulting Expansion, routed through a Shell LLC registered to the same New York address as Lena's former firm. I sat there staring at the numbers for a long time. Whoever had slipped me that envelope had taken a risk. A quiet rebellion in an office that had become sterile and political. I slipped it into my briefcase and walked out without looking back. By the time I reached the parking garage, I had 7 missed calls. The first was from Andrea Chan, Director of Curriculum for the Tri-State Education Consortium. We'd worked together for 12 years. Her voicemail was blunt. "Tell me this is a joke. We just renewed our contract with you. If they handed us to some junior analyst, I swear I'm pulling our deal." The second call was from Superintendent Ray Delgado in Kansas City. The third was from a textbook distributor in Oregon. The news had spread faster than I had. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel with one hand and staring at my phone with the other as the calls kept coming. I hadn't even told my wife yet. I hadn't told anyone. That night, I didn't sleep. I poured a glass of bourbon and sat in my study, watching the city lights flicker across the lake. Somewhere, Lena Morgan was celebrating another successful realignment. Somewhere, a boardroom full of people nodded and congratulated themselves on executing a seamless transition. But they didn't understand what they'd just done. They hadn't just removed an employee. They'd severed a lifeline. And for the first time in 18 years, I felt something shift. Not in anger, but in clarity. I wasn't going to get even. I was going to get to work. The first official sign of trouble came just 4 days after I was let go. Keystone's announcement hit the wires, thin, corporate, and suspiciously upbeat. Keystone Media Group is realigning its client services division to better serve a digital-first future. My name wasn't mentioned, of course. The messaging was designed to sound forward-thinking, proactive, and thoroughly bland. But anyone who had worked with me, anyone who had signed those long-term district deals, knew exactly what it meant. By the end of that week, 5 major clients had either frozen contracts or submitted formal termination notices. These weren't small accounts. The Illinois Public Charter Network, the Southeastern Board of Academic Resources, 2 of the largest urban school districts in the Midwest. Each represented millions in multi-year licensing and curriculum support. I didn't have to call anyone. They called me. Some were angry, some confused, and some just stunned. But one thing was clear. Lena had underestimated how personal this business really was. These weren't clients. They were relationships. And while you can replace a sales rep on a spreadsheet, You can't. Replace trust earned over years of shared late nights, urgent curriculum rollouts, and last-minute state compliance updates. Then came the internal leaks. It started small. An anonymous email from a Keystone team member. No name, just a screenshot. A private Slack conversation from the digital strategy team mocking clients, who had no tech fluency and still thought printed materials were relevant. It was exactly the kind of arrogance educators hate. That message made its way to a curriculum director in Ohio, and within 48 hours it was trending in an internal educator forum with over 30,000 members. I watched it unfold quietly. I didn't stoke the fire. I didn't speak publicly. I wasn't ready to break my NDA, and I wasn't interested in retaliation for its own sake. But I did start keeping records. Every message, every email, every LinkedIn post from Keystone touting progress while their core base slipped quietly out the back door. Then came the document drop. I don't know who sent it. It came from a burner email address and contained a folder with internal audit, drafts, early budget revisions, and notes from a compliance consultant hired months earlier. The documents confirmed what I'd suspected. The payments to Vertex had been inflated and funneled through a separate subsidiary, technically legal, ethically dubious. There were footnotes about internal concern over reporting optics and board exposure risk. I read it all twice. Then I printed a copy and locked it away. The next morning I got a call from a reporter at Education Weekly. She'd heard about my exit and the recent contract withdrawals. She wanted to comment. I declined, not yet. But her voice carried the edge of someone who knew a much bigger story was about to break. Meanwhile, the atmosphere inside Keystone turned toxic. A former colleague, Julia, called me late one evening. "People are leaving," she said. "Two of your former managers just walked out today. Lena tried to reassign their teams, but no one trusts her." Another message, this one from someone in client onboarding, told me that multiple schools had started asking to delay new launches until they could speak directly with Daniel. The kicker? One of the district leaders had begun copying Lena's personal email on complaints. Clients were bypassing the system, demanding to know why the person who had promised them partnership and guidance was no longer at the company. Internally, Keystone scrambled to retain face. They issued a half-hearted statement about honoring legacy relationships while leaning into transformational growth. But every word rang hollow, especially to the people who knew the truth. Then came the letter. A certified envelope arrived at my home. Inside, a formal notice from Keystone's legal counsel reminding me of my non-compete and non-disparagement agreements. The tone was polite but unmistakable. They were watching me, anticipating I'd make a move, preparing for a fight, but they misunderstood something fundamental. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't even trying to take anything back. I was listening, watching, waiting. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Let them panic. Let the silence speak louder than any headline. Let them realize, far too late, that their biggest mistake wasn't letting me go. It was assuming I'd disappear. I spent the next several weeks in quiet motion, not hiding, not retreating, but listening, collecting, absorbing. I met with a handful of former clients, not in boardrooms or through formal proposals, but over coffee in neutral spaces, old bookstores, community libraries, small-town diners where people still shook hands before talking business. I wasn't there to sell. I was there to understand what they needed now that the promises Keystone had made were unraveling. And over again I heard the same thing. "We didn't buy from Keystone," one district superintendent told me. "We bought from you." Another said, "They talk about platforms. You talked about students." The trust wasn't dead. It had just been orphaned. At first, I deflected their questions. "What are you working on now? Are you launching something? Can we work with you again?" I didn't have answers, not ones I could give, not with the non-compete hanging over me, vague as it was. It restricted direct engagement with current Keystone clients for 12 months. But what if I wasn't selling anything? What if I wasn't replacing them? but building something completely different. The idea wasn't mine. It came from Andrea, John, during a long walk through Grant Park. "You don't need another company," she said. "You need a collective, something not built on ownership, but on shared values. Shared leverage." That word stuck with me. Leverage. Not the corporate kind, but the kind built on trust, alignment, purpose. I called my attorney, Miriam James, a no-nonsense former federal counsel who had left her white shoe firm to start an independent legal advisory in Evanston. I walked her through the situation, the clause, the risks, the ethics. After 2 days of review, she called me back. "You're walking a razor's edge," she said. "But technically, you're not in violation. You're not poaching. You're not soliciting. You're just existing. And if others gravitate toward what you're doing, well, that's not illegal, that's gravity." So I did the only thing that made sense. I filed paperwork for something called the Clarity Education Collective, a public benefit organization structured as a trust, not a for-profit vendor. The goal wasn't to replace Keystone. It was to give those left behind a path forward. A decentralized framework where independent districts, curriculum directors, and educators could share resources, recommendations, and support, without sales quotas or marketing funnels. No shiny pitch decks, just experience, ethics, and transparency. There was no launch party, no social media campaign. I started with 5 former clients. I didn't pitch them, I just made space for them to meet, talk, and collaborate. I facilitated the conversations, shared context, asked questions, and slowly something started to form. One suggested a joint curriculum mapping tool. Another offered access to their analytics dashboard for shared learning outcomes. What began as mutual frustration turned into something that felt surprisingly like hope. And then, the moment that changed everything. I got a call from Jacob Monroe, a publishing veteran out of St. Paul who had run 3 district cooperatives and knew the procurement landscape better than anyone. He wasn't looking for a job, he just wanted in. "I've seen enough smoke to know where the fire is," he said. "This model you're building, it's what the industry's been starving for." I still didn't know if we were building a business, but I was starting to believe we were building a future. Not with sales scripts or slogans, but with people who understood that in education, real power isn't in control. It's in connection. By early spring, cracks in Keystone's polished facade had turned into full-blown fractures. I didn't have insider access anymore, but the signs were public and loud. The Southeastern Board of Academic Resources officially terminated their contract, citing a breakdown in support continuity. The Illinois Public Charter Network, one of Keystone's oldest and most loyal partners, published an open letter to stakeholders explaining their decision to exit all service agreements by June. Industry forums were on fire. A leaked client satisfaction report hit the inboxes of several education journalists, and the numbers were brutal. In just 3 months, client satisfaction had dropped by 47%, implementation delays had doubled, and product renewal interest had plummeted. For a company like Keystone, where reputation was half the product, this wasn't a bad quarter. It was a structural collapse. Then the real signal came. Lena Morgan went silent. Her weekly town hall videos stopped. Her LinkedIn feed, once an endless stream of hashtags and humble brags, went dark. Rumors swirled. She was on medical leave, on sabbatical, in strategic retreat. None of it mattered. To anyone paying attention, she was already gone in all the ways that counted. That's when Keystone's board made their move. The email came in late on a Monday evening, sent by a name I hadn't heard in a while, Thomas Abner, interim chair of the board. It was brief but unmistakable in its tone, a formal invitation to discuss an opportunity to assist in the company's operational recovery. No title was mentioned, but the implication was clear. They wanted me back. I met with Thomas and 2 other board members at a private law office downtown. No conference rooms this time, just a quiet space with closed doors and strong coffee. They were polite, composed, but I saw it in their eyes. Desperation wrapped in dignity. "We need you to come in as Chief Executive Officer," Thomas said, after 5 minutes of pleasantries. "Full authority over client operations, restructuring, and partner engagement." I waited. "And Lena?" "She's transitioning out," he said carefully. I leaned back in my chair. "You want me to come back and clean up the mess she made?" "We want you to restore what we lost," he corrected. "But the offer came with a catch. I'd need to sign a liability waiver regarding past decisions, drop any inquiry or commentary related to the Vertex contracts, agree to silence on what I'd learned. It wasn't a job offer. It was a deal to buy my silence, wrapped in a promotion." I asked for time to think. They agreed, hopeful. They had no idea what I was really thinking. Later that evening, I walked through the quiet halls of the Clarity Education Collective's shared workspace. Just a rented floor, in a converted library on the north side, with exposed brick and the faint smell of old books. There was no assistant waiting outside, no title plate on my door, just a whiteboard filled with ideas, shared curriculum tools, and handwritten notes from district partners. I stared at it all for a long time, and I knew this wasn't just a better job. It was a better way. I didn't want Keystone back. I wanted them to understand why they had lost something they never truly valued. The next morning, I declined the offer in a short, professional email. No fanfare, no gloating, just a quiet line at the end. "You're not asking for a leader. You're asking for a shield. I don't do that kind of work." I hit send, then opened my notebook. It was time to expand the collective, not to compete, to outgrow them entirely. Less than 2 weeks after I declined the CEO position, the board came back with a second offer. This, one dressed in more humility and a lot more money. They framed it as a partnership opportunity this time. Keystone, they said, wanted to license curriculum content from the Clarity Education Collective. Not acquire, not merge, just license. It was clever. On paper, it looked like a gesture of collaboration. In reality, it was a lifeline thrown by a company drowning in its own decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had once labeled my approach outdated, called my methods legacy-bound. Now they were asking to pay for access to those very methods, just repackaged with the word collective instead of sales division. I didn't reject the idea outright, because truthfully the educators Keystone still served didn't deserve to suffer from boardroom egos. I told them we'd consider a licensing arrangement, but only under strict conditions. First, no exclusivity. Second, complete transparency in how our content would be deployed. Third, they'd have to agree to public disclosure of the partnership terms, including the fact that the Clarity Collective retained full control of how its material was used. And fourth, perhaps most critically, the agreement would be non-renewable unless every partner district involved in the pilot opted in again, by name and by vote. The board squirmed. But desperation has a way of softening resistance. Within days, they agreed. The contract was signed. Keystone would license access to select Clarity resources for a 6-month trial, with 0 input on development and 0 leverage over member organizations. They thought this was their quiet comeback. But to everyone else watching the education sector, it was something else entirely. An admission. A public acknowledgement that the old ways they had tried to erase weren't obsolete. They were irreplaceable. Education industry media picked it up quickly. Ed Currents ran a piece titled, "The Pivot at Keystone, Humility in the Wake of Hubris." Education Weekly called it, "A Win for Relationship-Driven Reform." My inbox flooded with messages, some congratulatory, others cautious. Then came the most surprising call of all. Jacob Monroe. Yes, that Jacob, my former counterpart. The same one who'd stayed behind and tried to hold the pieces together in my absence. He called from his personal number, his voice hushed. "I'm done," he said. "They're still treating us like firewalls instead of people. They haven't changed, Daniel, they've just changed tactics." He didn't ask for a job. He asked for space to contribute, to rebuild, to be part of something that felt like it mattered again. There's room, I said, without hesitation. And it wasn't just him. Over the next month, 2 more senior project leads from Keystone quietly reached out. One district advisor, a content strategist, a handful of longtime client reps who had always felt like they were stuck translating between 2 different languages, human needs and corporate jargon. They came not because they needed work, but because they wanted meaning, and we gave them that. By the end of that quarter, Clarity had tripled its original member base. We weren't just holding ground, we were expanding, not by conquest, by invitation, and Keystone? They met their licensing deadline, paid their invoice, but the mood had shifted. We weren't the underdog anymore. We weren't the alternative. We were the new standard, not because we tore the old system down, but because we quietly built something that made it obsolete. From a business ethics standpoint, Daniel Rourke's story is less about revenge and more about resilience. In an era obsessed with disruption, we often forget that trust, transparency, and human connection are not relics of the past. They are the foundation of any lasting enterprise. What Daniel built with the Clarity Education Collective wasn't just a counterpunch to corporate overreach. It was a reminder that when companies lose sight of the people who make their success possible, they lose more than revenue. They lose relevance. Leaders like Lena Morgan come and go. But leaders like Daniel, they're the ones who change the rules by refusing to play the wrong game. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Sometimes doing things the right way doesn't just keep your integrity intact. It sets a new standard for everyone else to follow. Now I'd love to hear your take. Have you ever watched a system fall apart simply because it forgot to value people? Leave a comment below. I read everyone. And if this story gave you something to think about, maybe even something to believe in, consider subscribing for more real-world narratives that don't just entertain, they make us rethink the rules.